And to continue our presentation, I want to ask that a woman who was named as Time Woman of the Year in 2002 for her whistleblowing activities, for her writing a 13-page letter to the director of the FBI, working within the system to tell the system, the FBI, that they had missed clues, that they had missed clues to what had happened on 9/11, and she was telling officially the director of the FBI that his organization needed fixing. Please give a warm welcome to Coleen Rowley.
Thanks so much. I'm hoping I have at least a few of you tomorrow that will get so used to or loving wearing this orange jumpsuit, and the black hood goes with it. That maybe we'll march tomorrow in solidarity with these, I don't know, 60, 70 Guantanamo detainees who are on hunger strike. One is down to 76 pounds. And actually, they are force-feeding them, which is another form of torture. They could die. I mean, 76 pounds, you know, you don't live real long. So one of the reasons I'm here this week is because it hasn't ended. It absolutely has not ended. We've got, again, people dying on Guantanamo because of indefinite detention. Completely unethical, completely lawless, and of course, most of them are cleared for release. They're innocent, completely ineffective. You cannot get, I mean, this is the triple whammy. Always remember those words. Because what is unethical and illegal is always ineffective. We get lied to by propaganda saying that torture works to save lives. It's a form of utilitarian, it's faulty utilitarian logic. And it's popular culture. It started with Jack Bauer, this dumb show. That dumb show actually fueled the torture regime because all of the officials, including the highest level, our Supreme Court Judge Scalia, was a fan of that show. He gave speeches to jurists in Canada. Actually, this is you can't get worse. Our Supreme Court judge said, we all got to act more like Jack Bauer. Now, he's supposed to be the highest level upholding the law. Of course, Bybee is in the chain. He's a little down below Scalia. Scalia is supposed to be the highest level upholding the law. And yet, he is saying torture, for instance, of law. I'm going to give you 3 Latin terms today. One thing that you didn't introduce me. I taught constitutional law to the FBI for 13 years. And so these little technicalities of Miranda, for instance, that people are talking about, to be honest, Miranda is extremely complicated, and it is a technicality on how to give these rights if you miss a word. So that's what I taught. And in fact, if an agent messed up on giving those Miranda rights and or tried to say they had exigent circumstances in a search when they didn't have a warrant, all of these things, they would get the evidence suppressed because that's how the courts enforce the Constitution against government actors. Our law is our bulwark. It is our guard for us to be secure. The only reason we have law, to be honest, is because we want the rest of the world, in the United States, for instance, we want people to adhere to the law. And if the government begins not adhering to the law, we have a famous Brandeis, somebody quote it for me, Olmsted versus whatever, it's a famous quote. He says, if the government becomes the illegal breaker of the law, it gives rise to everyone breaking the law. And so he held the government responsible. There is no such thing as Nixon said. Nixon thought he was above the law. He thought he could do break-ins. And he said, if the president does it, it's not illegal. There's that theory. That goes back to the old days when there were kings. And the kings didn't follow their own laws. Okay, we got past that about 800 years ago with the Magna Carta, when the barons challenged the kings. We fast forward. Condi Rice, not too long ago, was actually in a hallway with some smart student And the smart student was questioning her about her role in the torture regime and the architecture. And she blurted out, "It's not illegal if the president does it." She blurted out the same thing as Nixon. You can find it on a YouTube. And that's incredible. It's why I'm here, because the law, when you're talking about security and law, we have this myth, and it comes from Jack Bauer. It comes from popular culture. Zero Dark 30 movies that show a young, beautiful female CIA agent beating confessions out of people and somehow saving the day. That's what leads to bin Laden. Completely inaccurate, false. But that popular culture has worked. We now have a high percentage of people in the United States, it varies sometimes with how the question is asked. Younger people versus older people. The religious group of people are more inclined to believe torture works, and I think Catholics are the worst. This movie, I don't know if they've done a poll since the Zero Dark 30, and there's more than one movie. There's another one, Manhunt, out. Liberal audiences at Sundance applauded the 3 real CIA operatives, not Jessica Chastain, the fictional one. The 3 real ones who were part of the torture, the black sites and stuff, go on stage after Manhunt. That's the documentary form of Zero Dark 30. And they are applauded right now. That's how misinformation and popular culture about this, and it's basically fear. Fear works on people. Our psyches are hardwired that way. Fear, hate, greed, false pride, and blind loyalty will work on almost everybody. And if you get inundated for 12 years with this, it basically turns a whole nation into jelly. And yes, completely unlawful violations. And actually, this is what is hurting our security. Okay, these are not in trade-off with each other, as Benjamin Franklin said. If you trade your liberty for a little security, you will have neither. That's Benjamin Franklin. It's even worse than that. In fact, you lose your security, and that's what you're seeing with this kind of blowback. The reason why law, and this is a really I did not. Help. This is my anti-torture group in Minnesota, and we produced a torture timeline, and there's 11 of these, and the only bad thing from a March standpoint is they're small font, but the small font is because they're footnoted. Every single thing in here, starting with how all major religions have ethics rules about do unto others as you would want them, the golden rule essentially. The way law started, it started as ethics principles in all major religions. There were no policemen, there were no courts in early man times. But they, over time, realized that principle, the golden rule, do unto others, was very valuable. And it wasn't just ethical. Eventually, it gets solidified into all the various different, in religion, and then it gets solidified in secular law. And you get to that, so it starts with all the main religions, variations of this. Then you get to George Washington. We skipped a little. The Magna Carta, I forgot. The Magna Carta, which is that you can't just point to somebody and say they're guilty. You can't be the king. There's a presumption of innocence. They get to prove, as opposed to a bounty. You're not purchased. You get to prove, if you have some evidence, that I am not guilty. It's that simple. That's the Magna Carta. And then you get to George Washington, who actually in the Revolutionary War had captives, and he ordered that they be treated, I can't remember his exact quote, but it's here, and these are all very well footnoted. Now, most of this torture timeline, starting here to about here, is the Bush administration. And there's this whole series of things that occur and how we get to violating the law that is considered the most sacrosanct against torture. In Latin, it's called jus cogens. Jus cogens means there's no excuse, no loophole, no emergency exception. Torture cannot be done even in wartime. You can do the law of war, for instance, does permit all kinds of atrocities compared to what we would be in peacetime. The law of war is looser. That's why we don't have wars of choice or wars of aggression, because your law does take a big beating. And when you say we're going to war, it does set the dogs of war loose, and your laws really get submerged in the back seat. But even in wartime, in the law of war, you cannot torture. It's jus cogens. Now, to get that, thrown away, how did that happen? Well, the very first thing that happened, just to trace this quickly, and watch my time here. I lectured law for 13 years, and this is so dear to me because we don't have law anymore. We're in a war on the law. It's that bad. We are in a war on the law. The first memos that are written John Yoo. Everybody knows John Yoo, and now a well-known, established, and he speaks all over the United States. His co-author was actually Robert Delahunty. They wrote a series of memos. They wrote memos on how it's legal to kidnap in extraordinary rendition. That began ferrying people, kidnapping people, and taking them to black sites. They wrote one that became an order in November of 2001, very early. And what this law said was that the captives we get in the war on terror, we're not going to give their day in court. We got to come up with, and one of the officials called it outer space. We'll come up with a location, was Guantanamo. It'll be outer space, and there will be no court proceedings. Cheney, by the way, was in the Nixon administration, and when this reckoning came to Nixon, and he was told he was not above the law, that Cheney saw this and wanted to reverse it, wanted to go back to the time period where the executive was all powerful. And we have to decide what's right and wrong. We don't care about legislation or judiciary branch. And so there was this chafing to get back to the era where you had this unitary executive. So this first order said we're going to create a place. There will be no legal rights for these people. January of 2002, and they did. January of 2002 was the more memos written by Robert Delahunty and John Yoo. And these memos said, the Geneva Convention's law of war do not apply. Those first memos, there's three of them. Actually, a State Department lawyer disagreed. And he tried then to say, what? The Geneva Conventions don't apply? And he tried to argue, but then they went back, and Bush, of course, signed this thing in February, saying the Geneva Conventions do not apply. In fact, the Constitution Project report, most people are focused on the later one that they call the torture memo that John Yoo writes, and people don't know about these earlier ones that are written. There's a whole series, and they all interlock, these legalization memos that legalize the illegal. There's a whole series of them that are very complicated to read. They boggle your mind to read. They're all sophistry. So he signs this thing, and Guantanamo is set up. They deliver the first prisoners to Guantanamo the day after that memo is written. It was written on January 11th, and January 12th, I believe, or January 10th, 11th was the day it was written. January 12th is the day they deliver the first prisoners to Guantanamo. Now fast forward, because they actually get what they believed. It turned out to be wrong, but they believed that they had their first high-value terrorist suspect in custody, Abu Zubaydah, in March of that year. So there's a long history here. A fellow FBI agent who I will commend for having stood up against torture, Ali Soufan is his name, has written a book about this. You can read, I forget the name of the book right now, but you can read his book. He was called in and tried to interview Zubaydah in the normal way. And then after a few days, and he got him to talk. They were, developing rapport, which is always the way to get timely information, intelligence, and possibly to save lives. That's the only effective way. This other Jack Bauer thing doesn't work. In fact, all you're going to do is get people lying to you and false confessions and all the other stuff. You can get a lot of false confessions, by the way. So it works to get false confessions, but it does not work to get good information. So he was getting information. He got pulled out by the CIA. After a short few days, he got pulled out, and they said, we're going to go to the dark side. And so they began then this series of increasingly harsh, enhanced interrogation. And these were forms of torture. These are all illegal. They might be inhumane abuse, so there's different things. Cruel and inhumane abuse, is considered less torture light, and then you get to the harsh, even more terrible ones. So what they did was they had him, of course, sensory deprivation is one thing. He was already in pain. Eventually, they hit him against walls. They put him in like a coffin, so he was completely sensory deprivation. These were CIA experiments in the 50s of sensory deprivation. And they realized indefinite detention, anytime your senses are deprived, and even putting things over your fingers so you can't feel with your hands. Their own experiment back in the 50s where they had their own people trying to see how this had an effect on you, they couldn't take it. These are people who volunteered to try the experiment. And they had to stop those experiments very quickly of sensory deprivation because they're so horrendously bad and effective. You go crazy real quickly. And so they did all of these things, increasingly harsh, water, cold, heat, sleep deprivation. They just went through. And every one of these, by the way, White House, Bush administration, the so-called principals were meeting. And they were determining, talk about sadistic, meeting in the White House to determine, we tried the cold water, this time we're going to try the coffin. I mean, you can imagine, Condi Rice is in the thick of this. She's one of the principals. Of course, Dick Cheney, everyone knows. But there's a whole group of them meeting, and Condi Rice is in the thick. And they get to July, and I should say, too, they actually brought Ali Soufan and the FBI back in after the first week wasn't working. And then because it was almost kind of like an experiment between the FBI and the CIA. What would work better? The dark side, torture of the CIA, who doesn't follow the law, or the FBI, who has this long tradition of trying to follow the law? So there was this little back and forth for a while. But then eventually, and he actually, even the second time, he says, well, the second time they brought me in, it was a lot harder because, to talk to Zubaida because he'd already started. But then they went back. So you get to July, and they decide in the White House that they will have to go to waterboarding as the final step. And Condi jumped the gun. She goes to Tenet in July of 2002 and tells Tenet, go do it, it's your baby. She gives the order. Of course, it's very hard, if you think about popular culture, if you think about the beautiful red-headed Jessica Chastain hitting people and getting information, and you think about the beautiful Condi Rice in her tailored suits, she's speaking all over. She's giving concerts and completely rehabilitated now. And if you think about her, the beautiful female, she's actually speaking in Minnesota to our Legal Aid Society, sponsored by our Bar Association. Now, in 3 weeks, and her title is Why Democracy Matters. You cannot get more Orwellian or more hypocritical, and yet most people don't know this. 5 minutes. So she gives the order, but then the CIA realizes we are going to be the ones left out hanging out to dry. And so they go back and tell John Yoo to write the torture memo. And that's when he writes the really shoddy one, because he's under pressure, that says everything up to organ failure or death is not torture. And that when that gets to the light of day and gets seen, people, of course, recognize. It takes years, though, to get that point. So then they proceed on. What ends up happening here at the end, and it's not over, not only is it not over in Guantanamo, but what happened under Bush is they realized that all of the court process, the Supreme Court struck this down. In the meantime, this idea of the Geneva Conventions not applying and that you could have a place where law doesn't apply, like Guantanamo, was struck down in a series of Supreme Court decisions. Hamdan, Boumediene, there was a series of them. So up in 2005, 6, and 7, it was struck down. So the Obama administration comes in and realizes capture or kill. Capturing now has come back to having to have some form, rudimentary form of due process. So what's the answer to that? If you kill. And so the drone assassination program, which by the way, yesterday was a hearing in Senator Durbin had a hearing in the Senate about this, and hopefully some of these points came out, because what they've created now is no way to get into court. Because before, when they're alive, they could have attorneys that could challenge. When you're on a kill list, they tried to get an injunction when they knew some. First of all, how are you going to know? You're never going to know you're on a kill list. And again, all of the people that were originally rounded up by the FBI for questioning turned out to be innocent. There were 1,000 people real quickly rounded up after 9/11. And then a large portion of Guantanamo detainees have been innocent. It just stands to reason that this track record, some or maybe almost all of the drone assassination victims are equally innocent. And yet they have no way of proving this, because you're in a list, and the Al-Awlaki case, the ACLU and the Center for Constitutional Rights tried to get an injunction. The judge says, that's political. That's a political question. And I can understand it's a little problematic, but I don't want to get involved. It was that simple. Now what's happened is after they were killed, the estate, the next of kin, can bring a suit for unconstitutional actions because they were citizens. And right now there's been a government motion to dismiss. The government under Obama has dismissed all of the lawsuits challenging torture of innocent victims. They've been dismissed, and it's this crazy notion of secrecy. So that's why this is continuing. And in many ways it's continuing. The last one here is how do we return from the dark side? The dark side is where we're at right now. It may be even darker than it was before. And until we can regain our balance, that's actually what the terrorists want. They want to terrorize you into giving up your ethics and your law, and so that you do stupid things. And of course, this is going already very terribly backfiring. And there are some smart people in government. This Constitution Project is a great thing because it's bipartisan. This idea that this is political, that this is an issue between Democrats and Republicans. So I'm going to cease here, and maybe we'll get some time for questions. But if I have any volunteers that want to march in orange jumpsuits, come see me afterward. And thank you very much.